If your podcast growth strategy doesn't include podcast guesting, you're missing out on one of the best tactics for attracting new audiences. That's because podcast guesting allows you to speak to engaged audiences who already love consuming podcasts. Our guest today is a former client of PodWritten, and we've worked with her to secure numerous podcast features that have helped her grow her show and bring clients to her business. From this chat, you'll learn why being selective with podcasts you pitch yourself to is so important, the benefits of hiring a professional to manage your pitching and outreach, and what you should look for in a specialist if you want to outsource this work. I'm your host, Sam Breakgear, and this is Mics to Millions, your go-to podcast to empower you to grow your audience, successfully promote your show, and monetize your work. Thanks for joining. Now let's get into it. My guest today is the host of Insatiable, a top 1% ranked podcast that promotes a truthful, holistic approach to freedom from cravings, emotional eating, binging, bargaining, and body image. The show shares interviews, practical advice, and radically honest discussions about food, truth, psychology, and change. It's been running since January 2016 and receives roughly 4,500 monthly listeners. She's a holistic nutritionist and creator of Truce, a framework for complex change that creates sustainable, holistic well-being, and the Truth Coaching Certification. Ali Shapiro, welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me, Sam.
Fantastic. I'm really happy to have you on because obviously we've known each other for a while and worked together for a while. So this is going to be a super exciting episode to really dissect more about your show. And I want to start off by asking quite a deep question. What do you consider to be your greatest success in podcasting?
My greatest success. Well, I'm really bad at doing the greatest. But I think what comes to me is that I feel like in my little part of the world, I've been able to change the conversation of food and health being about willpower, discipline, and restriction, and expanding the definition of health to a more holistic definition that includes emotional well-being, advocating for yourself, understanding that bodies are wise and mysterious, not just something to be battled. So yeah, I think that's on like a macro level, hopefully the biggest accomplishment.
Yeah, and I think that's absolutely fair to say. I love the work that you're doing. And it's fantastic to work alongside you to help get your message out there. And you've been doing this podcast for a while. I mean, looking at the podcasting space in general, 2016 it's quite early to start a podcast. And I'd say that you were ahead of the curve somewhat. What inspired you to create Insatiable at that time?
Yeah, I know. 2016, it was like, aren't we just doing radio? What is a podcast? Yeah, so there were a couple things that came together. One, I had lived in Philadelphia for about 12 years at that point. Well, and I left there in late 2014, but I wanted to make my company more virtual. And I was leaving Philadelphia where I had an in-person business. I had done NBC TV for 4 years. I had a regular spot on a really wonderful show there called The 10 Show. I was doing a lot of in-person events. This is, obviously pre-COVID. I went to grad school there at Penn, and I thought I would like die there. I was like, I'm never leaving. And then all of a sudden I started to feel like I needed a change. And so I moved to back to New York with my husband for a little bit. And then we decided to just move back here to Pittsburgh, where I'm from, because we wanted to start a family and we wanted lower cost of living. So I wanted a way to reach more people virtually, because a lot of people were online at the time, but it wasn't like it is today. So that was one thing. The second thing is that what I really value is depth and nuance. And again, this expansion of the conversation. And I feel like podcasting is a really great medium for that. Blog posts can't really do it. And again, social media wasn't super big at the time, but social media certainly can't do that. And I am insatiably curious. So I also wanted a medium where I could like interview people and ask them the questions that I wanted to have answered. So it was kind of all three of those things coming together.
Yeah, makes absolute sense, especially considering the fact that your message and what you have to share is so complex. I can't really see it like being easily turned into like a 10-second video or reel or something for Instagram. I mean, I'm sure with the right kind of approach, it would work, but it just seems like a format that is better suited for podcasting. So that's awesome to hear. And I want to know, how did you reach your first 10K listeners? And do you remember how long it took?
Yeah. Oh my God. I don't remember how long it took, but I originally had a co-host, Juliet, we're still great friends. And I remember there was like, if you could get, I think like a certain amount of reviews and a certain amount of listens, like within the first something days, you could be showcased on iTunes New and Noteworthy. And I know that we hit that, like we really worked to hit that. I don't think podcasting is democratic as when we first started. Now you need a lot of big budgets and everything. But I think that's probably how we first got our first 10,000. I had a co-host who had, a very different audience than me, a very different approach than me. And then we worked really hard to get our friends and family to review it, listen to it, and ask them to spread it to other people. There was really no strategy, Sam. Sorry.
No, that's okay. I mean, like using your own network is somewhat of a strategy anyway. Like you said, it was a different game back then. I think if you were to take that strategy of just using your own network now, it might be a bit harder to reach that kind of goal, given how competitive the space is. But clearly, it worked for you back then. And did you have a big following, or did Juliet have a big following at all?
I think we probably had big followings for Philadelphia. I mean, I had been doing online programs at that point for a while, like for a couple of years. And I had had other like more traditional media plays, like one of my clients was in the Philadelphia Inquirer for her emotional eating success story and her weight loss success. I had a writer approach me about featuring my client in Prevention Magazine. And that came out, I believe, in 2016. And that brought a lot of people to me. And probably the podcast was a huge engagement tool, at that time for them. And looking back, we did have guests on, and I'm sure the guests, when they shared the podcast, that helped bring a bigger following. I think so. As I'm talking this out loud, like to summarize it, I think Juliet and I had strong micro followings, right? But I think the podcast obviously helped it grow.
Hmm. One of the things that I really love about your business is that you frequently host community gatherings. So to give listeners some context, these are gatherings that serve as like a free coaching hour for members of your community to join and help them wherever they are on their food, health, and body journey. And I really love this because it's a fantastic way of engaging with your followers for your business. And like I think as a podcaster, it's a really smart way of making yourself more available to your audience and just engaging with them. Now, how have these gatherings influenced Insatiable and the content you cover on the podcast?
Yeah, it's a great question. And one of the things we're actually going to work on is making that community gathering more connected to the podcast. Because right now it's kind of like community gathering. I don't think people understand that we're necessarily, it's as connected to the podcast. And we want that call to get people connected and talking with each other as much as, and bringing up conversations and questions for the podcast. So we're turning some of those gatherings into podcast episodes, actually, that we've done. And then the other way is, I think it helps me, and I think anyone who's an expert in what they do can understand that. I got into this because of my own eating issues. They were really bad. They were really severe. My health was really compromised, and the methodology I created got me out of that. And so sometimes it's hard for me to remember where people are right in their moment. Like last community gathering, like people were coming with like, I'm craving so much sugar, right? And it's like, oh my God, I forget what that's like. But that community gathering brought me back to that place and enabled me to be like, okay, we got to focus on protein, right? But then in my approach is like, well, there isn't a right diet that's for everyone. So maybe I need to do a podcast on the different types of proteins, kind of the first steps around cravings or whatnot. But I said to those people, I was like, you could listen to this episode where I talk about this. So for further up, for follow up, they now have targeted, supported podcasts that can help them. It helps create these gatherings I can turn into podcasts. And then it helps keep me current on what kind of topics and things may be relevant, especially because by now I have so many episodes, but some of those episodes, again, I started this 8 years ago. I have different views on now, right? Like, I hope I do. If I'm learning and evolving, I will. So it can help me replay old broadcasts, but talk about my updated thoughts or something like that. So there, it just gives, it's really a creative cauldron, a connection cauldron, so that I'm using witches metaphors. The witches were the healers. That's why they burned them. I don't know. I got off on a tangent, Sam. Sorry. I answered your question.
I think no, you answered it fantastically, and I have to say I really love this and the way you implement it. And it was actually so for context, like we've been working together for a while, and that was a pivotal moment for me joining that call when I joined one of your community gatherings because it really gave me an insight into the issues that the people that would come to you with, the kind of conversations you were having with them. And I think it really allowed me to just understand your message at a deeper level. And I think that it's so great that you create this space where people can join you. And it really is a win-win for you to understand more about the places where your clients are coming to you from. And it's good for them because they might not be ready to maybe take the full step with you or like for whatever reason, but this does give them an opportunity regardless to engage with you. And I think it's really nice. I'm personally looking to implement this for my own business. So you very much inspired me, and I really like what you've done here.
Oh, thanks, Sam. I appreciate that. Yeah, and it's a great way, I think, too, to give back, and as well. But yeah, like triple win all over.
Yeah, yeah, definitely. But one of the things I want to know is that you often take pauses between seasons of your podcast. Do these pauses ever impact the growth of Insatiable?
Yeah. Oh, I'm sure. You know, I think what happened was, I think putting the pause in context might help. When we first started, again, I was, oh my God, how old was I? I was like 36, 37 years old. Juliet's 10 years younger than me. I didn't have a child. I hadn't gone through menopause, and I was still in hustle culture, right? And I really looked at the podcast in terms of like, only the numbers matter. How many downloads are we getting? Is it improving, et cetera, right? It was like all I was focusing on was like more, more, and more. And it's fun. It's fun to feel like you're having a bigger impact. And frankly, I feel like what I have to say needs to be heard more.
Yeah.
So I don't have any like insecurities there. And after a while, that weekly podcasting schedule gets really grinding, especially if you're doing social media to promote the episodes, all that stuff. And around the time, I guess, when it was, Juliet felt like she was working on really scaling and franchising the gym that she worked for, and she just felt like she couldn't keep up the workload. And so after about 100 episodes, she decided to leave the podcast. And it was good. It was a time where Trump had just been elected, and I wanted to go in a more political direction because bodies are very political, and she was not as interested in that. And so at that point, I was like, I cannot keep up this schedule. Like, if I want to like do this at all, I have to like find a better way to do it. And so that's where seasons came. And I used to do the seasons. I don't even remember the cadence of them, but I remember I was doing them quite frequently. I think I felt like I was doing like 3 a year, and they were each, 7 seasons long. But then after, I think it was season, yeah, 11, where I had done a whole season on like basically holistic fertility and just sharing again what I had learned, because I had been diagnosed as infertile, and like I worked through that using alternative methods and was really in that space. But then after I was postpartum, I was going through menopause at the same time, like I just burnt out completely. And those 3 years of like kind of being in the underworld, my focus was really stepping back and saying, okay, what do I want this podcast? What's meaningful about it right now? I love podcasting. I love interviewing. I love researching. It's like, I think what I excel at is synthesizing and conversation. And I was starting to feel like I didn't want to do it anymore. And so for me, it became less about more and more growth and what is the podcast serving in relation to my business. And for me, it was like, okay, it helps people understand what I'm about. It helps them educate themselves if this is the right thing for them. And so then I would just do a podcast season around my launches. And that we're changing that now that I have more energy, now that my son sleeps through the night. And the growth is going to be less about growth for growth's sake, but more growth to reach the program numbers that I want. So I'm back to wanting to grow, but not in this just like insatiable growth way.
Yeah. Like growth at any cost.
Yeah, yeah. And that's like where you come in, and hiring you has been super helpful of like, okay, where is my market? Where do the best clients come from?
Mm.
What are those podcasts? Because it's like you could be on bazillion podcasts, right? But it's like, okay, these are the ones that are going to sustainably grow my business, and I can grow in a sustainable way that supports the podcast, supports me, but isn't just about unbridled growth, which frankly is what's killing the planet, and we have to
Yeah.
extract it. We have to extract that urge from ourselves, right? So
Yeah.
I'm not saying people don't want their podcast to grow, but it's like in service of what,
Yeah.
I think is a good question.
Yeah, absolutely. Because it's obvious. I mean, I've spoken to previous podcast hosts and I'm like, what did you see come from like putting out 2 episodes a week instead of 1 episode when they've made that jump? And they're like, oh, yeah, definitely. We get more listeners, we get more this and that. And there's no doubt that the more content you put out, the more your show is going to grow. But it does come at a cost. Either that's the cost of your physical and mental health because you're the one doing everything, or because you're outsourcing as much as you can. And there are some people that I've spoken to where they're able to run multiple podcasts because they have teams behind them. But it definitely comes at a cost. And I think, at least for me, it's always come down to a question of sustainability. Like, what's sustainable for you? What's like, whether it's that mentally, financially, physically, or whatever, when it comes to the consistency of a podcast. And yeah, I think growth at any cost can be quite dangerous.
Yeah, and I think I think people who are starting podcasts have to think of like, how is this serving my business? Like, if you want to run ads, right? Like, if you want to grow it so that if you're more like an affiliate, like you really have to think about your business model, I guess is what I'm saying. Like a lot of people make the majority of their money in their business from affiliates, right? Which I see advertising as you're like an affiliate for that advertiser, right? So if that's your model and you're doing that, then growing your podcast to the point that you can get decent return on like ad revenue may serve you, right? But for me, my podcast serves to fill my programs and have the right clients come to me. So I don't need a volume that's someone who is trying to make like advertising revenue off their podcast.
Yeah, that's a really important point to make. I think that's super valuable. And you did actually mention something that I wanted to bring up. Thank you for the little plug there. But I wanted to say, yeah, so for context or for background for the listeners, we've worked together because you obviously were a client of PodWritten, and I represented you as a podcast booking specialist to secure you interviews on other podcasts. And I really want to know what first inspired you to look to get a specialist. Like, what made you think, you know what, I want to hire someone to do outreach on behalf of me to get me booked as a guest on podcasts?
Yeah. Well, first was realizing that my podcast is my best marketing tool, because people come, they listen, they hear what I'm about, and then they can decide if they like it or not, right? Like you said, we go to deep places there. It's some people describe it as raw, like you're going to get to know me, you're going to get to know my outlook. And I have been on other pretty big podcasts, relatively speaking, before hiring you, and kind of before this whole like pause in my life from going through menopause and having a baby. But when I came back out, and I had a PR background in corporate back in the day. And every time I've pitched somewhere, I like landed it. I have enough relationships because I've been, working for myself for 16 years now. I have a good, I think I have a relatively trustworthy reputation. But when I opened up to start pitching myself, like the podcast landscaping had changed. I was like, there are so many podcasts here. I'm overwhelmed. I don't want to sift through them. And I really think you need someone outside of yourself to help you with your messaging sometimes at a level that, again, part of that curse of expertise is like, but what's top of the funnel, right? Like if we think of awareness, engagement, and sales, I follow this model that a business strategist I work with, Michelle Warner, is like, if you're doing relationship marketing, which is the type of marketing I'm doing, it's really important that like sales doesn't become like the sleazy sales that I hate, like 5 hours left, 4 hours left, like, oh my God, you're going to miss out. Your life is going to be ruined if you don't. I hate that shit. And so, like, my podcast is like my engagement strategy. So once people hear about me, then they can come to my podcast to really engage with my work. But I needed help with more people knowing about me and that more higher level, more broad messaging. And so I wanted to hire you and PodWritten because I needed help with messaging for a newish offering I had around my certification. I did not have any relationships with anyone in like at a volume scale, right? And then I also needed help with my Truce with Food offering. And I wanted a sounding board for the messaging there. But also, you all helped me realize, okay, we want a podcast that has interaction, that has engaged listeners, that has hosts that have aligned messaging and all this stuff. So basically, good relationship fit, right? And so I wanted someone who had those skills, and that I am at the point where I can't do everything myself, and nor should I be. And I was using our work so that more people would find my podcast, and it would grow, but through basically borrowing other people's audiences and people who already listen to podcasts. It's an easier jump than, like, some people still don't listen to podcasts.
Yeah, that's awesome to hear. And it has been obviously so wonderful working with you. I know that you've been really happy with the service and you're a client that we love to work with. So it's been a fantastic match. And like, do you have any advice for anyone who's listening who is considering hiring a specialist to get them booked on a podcast as a guest? And what do you think that they should look out for when they go to use this service?
Yeah. Well, first of all, this is like unscripted, but there were so many hosts that were like, oh my God, Sam and Santi are amazing. Like, they're really good, and they were like, do you like them? Because I think they were thinking,
Hmm.
like, maybe I should use them. And I didn't know to think about that, but the person you're hiring is establishing the relationship for
Hmm.
you. And I can't tell you, as a podcast host myself, I get the worst pitches from other agencies. Like,
Yeah.
I'm serious. Like, all people do is tell me about the person. There's nothing about, where does this meet my audience? How's this going to benefit my audience? It's just like, here's what I want to talk about. And I'm like,
Hmm.
I say to my husband, I'm like, these people are paying people to do this shitty pitching for them. Like, I can't believe it. And so I think, not even like thinking about that, of like, you do such a great job of like caring about the host, caring about their audience, being like responsible, following up with like, hey, reminder, you guys are meeting today. If there's anything wrong here, like, just all of that emotional labor that, I think as a business owner, you are often having to do for relationship management. You do so well. And it gives me the peace of mind, which was part of the value I wanted. It was like, I want to show up and do the thing. I don't want to be thinking about how the sausage is made all the time. Like, I have to think enough about that kind of stuff with my work and my son. You know what I mean? It's like,
Yeah.
so I think that's important. I think the other thing is, you had existing relationships, and that's something that I did not have. I think people sometimes think, oh, if I get on like one big show or whatever. And again, that can help, but you also just want to like get on a lot of shows, get a lot of exposure. There's so many niches out there, and you just got to get out there, and you just got to do practice. I mean, again, I had this like weird combination where I felt like I know what I'm talking about, I know what I'm doing, and yet I'm having trouble with this like awareness piece of like, how do I get people, for people listening, my work is about how food is coupled with attachment. And so we turn to food, not because we don't have willpower or discipline, but because we feel unsafe in our lives, or we feel detached from belonging. And that is like very abstract, right? It's like there's so many rabbit holes. And it's like, by going on all the podcasts, and we started with these pitches, but by, I feel like, the end, or like the middle, and again, there was success along the way, but at the end, by just doing practice and like the random stuff that came up in all these podcasts, it's like, I feel like I've nailed a really good interview format for Truce with Food and for the Truce coaching certification. And it comes down to me now, like almost asking the host these three big questions and then going back and forth with them. And I'm sharing all that because I think working with someone like you, you're going to get a volume of interviews just to practice with, and what resonates with the host, what doesn't, especially if you're trying to do work that is ahead of the curve. So all the practice was like essential to really nailing what is it that actually shows, not tells, in my case.
Yeah, and you know what, your interviews have always been fantastic to listen to, and it is awesome hearing that evolution over time. And I did not know that podcast hosts said those wonderful things about us, so that has really brightened my day, and that's so nice to hear. I mean, I have to say, like at the core of what we do, I believe I was once told in one of my first jobs ever that my boss once said if a job's worth doing, it's worth doing well, and that always stuck with me. And considering that I am super passionate about podcasting, I'm super passionate about what I do, and like us at PodWritten, that like runs to our core, that like I want this to be a service where, exactly as you said, the person that's like hiring us, they just need to turn up for the interviews and we'll take care of everything else. So that's great to hear that like the intention that we set out for as a business is absolutely being met. And yeah, thank you for those kind words.
Yeah, and the other thing I just want to say is you and Santi reminded me, like, bring this back to your work. And it's like, oh my God, yeah. Like these things that again may seem so obvious, but you don't know what you don't know, right? So it was like so helpful for you all to listen to some of my interviews and be like, you could have inserted this here or this there. And it was like, oh yeah, that's why I'm doing, I mean, ultimately that's why I'm doing these, right? Yes, I want to provide value and educate and all that stuff. And I love good conversation, but it's like, remember, remember.
Yeah, that's a really hard line to walk sometimes, like offering value but not being too promotional. I mean, that's one of the issues that I think even you mentioned, like with a lot of pitches, people just stuff promoting themselves, promoting whatever, and they don't offer the value there. So it is a skill set to be able to walk both of those lines, to provide the value and promote what you're there to promote, like what you personally are there to promote anyway. But yeah, that's fantastic to hear. And what were some of the most successful steps that you have taken to promote Insatiable over the years?
Yeah. Well, I think again, hiring you all and getting on more podcasts to get more people to listen to my podcast. It's like that's what I've done recently. I think the other thing is when you're doing your own episodes, referencing old episodes can really help. And I think then when I do more traditional media, mentioning that, or when I do speaking engagements, talking about that, or when I go in to teach in other people's classrooms, again, it's relationship management, mentioning my podcast. I haven't done anything beyond that. I mean, I would like to turn the tables. What should I be doing, Sam? What should I be doing?
Oh, where to start? Well, I think it really depends on a few things. I always say that it depends on like resources and time, because one person can only do so much. So obviously, I always say this, and I am biased. I will admit I run a company where we do podcast guesting as a focus, but absolutely podcast guesting, because if you're trying to promote on Instagram, you're running ads there, or wherever you're trying to promote your podcast, it's fantastic that you're getting it out there. But people who are listening to podcasts already, they're the ones that you want to go after, because it's way easier to get someone who's already listening to a podcast to go listen to yours versus someone on Instagram who has no interest in podcasts. So I think that you've definitely nailed it there. There's other options as well, like about social media, but I think that social media is a whole nother, it's almost like a full-time job in itself when you really get into it, because then you also have to think about what content am I going to put out there, what platforms am I going to put it on. One other option that we also do, and I know you do a great job of this as well, now I was going to ask about it, but just writing as well. So here at PodWritten, we really focus on blogs. We focus on blogs to share our knowledge about our business, and that's really driven a lot of organic traffic. And as well, for every episode we put out, we publish a blog with like the key takeaways, and that's been fantastic as well. So definitely written content where you can is excellent. But I do know that you have a newsletter and you write frequently, and I follow that newsletter. So I wanted to ask you, like, what's the relationship with the newsletter, like with your podcast, with these two mediums? Like, how do you balance them out, and how do they kind of like work together to promote your business and kind of build each other up?
Yeah, I mean, you're asking me this at a time where, like I told you before we got on the mic, that I'm kind of putting together a more strategic marketing strategy and continuing to think more of a business, more like a business. But I think, yeah, I do promote the episodes to my list. I often backlink to past episodes if I remember that I have them. I think that's part of the challenge is when you have so many episodes, it's like you forget that you've talked about certain things before. So one of the things that we're going to do moving forward, and that's what I've done in the past. So is like, okay, oh, I talked about this here. I can hyperlink to this, to your point, like in a blog, but I also send that to the newsletter. It's interesting because my last program, Truce with Food, just got filled. Great enrollment numbers, fantastic group, wonderful, wonderful people. And I went back and it was like, oh, all this email marketing that you're told to do, I don't really think that moved the needle. Like when I look at it, it's like they found me, they listened to a bunch of episodes, they looked at some of my free offerings, and then some people booked a call, but then they just signed up. And it was because they were coming from other communities where people had recommended me. So the trust was there. So I'm really reconsidering. I know email marketing is still important, but it becomes less and less effective every year. And so one of the things we're doing now is going back and looking at like my top episodes. And a lot of them have to do with sugar, which is not like a surprise. And so what we're actually looking to do from like a business email marketing perspective is I have this program called Freedom from Cravings, but I don't promote it a lot. It's self-study. I don't love giving self-study programs because often people won't necessarily do all of it by themselves. You need a group, and that's why I love running groups. But what we're thinking of doing is starting to go look at the old episodes, rebroadcast them, update them if they need to be, and then really drastically discount the price of Freedom from Craving since it's the self-study and not the live version. And so that even if people only do one of the lessons, they get a ton of value out of it. And then that gets them to understand more about my work because the email marketing and the podcast is probably going to be around that kind of entry level point to the work when people are just having so many cravings in general, right? Like the people who came to my last community call. It's like, oh my God, it's hard to do a lot of the emotional work if you're just starving all day. So it's like, okay, this will make the people who want to continue on better clients. They'll get better results in Why Am I Eating This Now or Truce with Food if they can do this foundational material first. So even if they do one or two lessons, they're going to get a ton of value. They're going to be further along and they'll just be, in my orbit more. So that's probably what we're going to focus on in terms of the email and the podcasting serving each other.
That's a really smart use of previous episodes. Like we always do say, or one of the things that's come up a lot is the use of looking into which episodes that you've published that have been the most popular and then just like focusing around that or gravitating more towards that because it's clearly what your audience wants to hear more about. So that's super intelligent. Yeah, I look forward to seeing what comes from that. Obviously, as one of your followers, I look forward to seeing what arrives in my inbox. And I wanted to ask you something. This is kind of I suppose it's a little bit off topic in a sense. But I understand that your show, like as we've discussed, it covers some really deep and raw topics. I personally think that you handle these complex topics with like real grace and care. In fact, in one of your previous episodes, I heard you warn the listeners saying, like, in the last 10 minutes of this episode, we talk about weight loss and calories. If that's not where you are right now, just don't listen to the last 10 minutes. So I understand, like, with this level of complexity, what advice would you give to aspiring podcast hosts who want to talk about complex, deep, and raw topics, but are potentially maybe fearful of upsetting or triggering listeners or saying the wrong thing accidentally?
Yeah, that is such a good question in this day and age where people are so quick to judge you, right? If you say the wrong thing. First of all, thank you for saying that you think I handle it well. I appreciate that. I think that is a product of the self-compassion I've had to develop with myself and all the ways that I really beat myself up and judged myself. And so I think there's two things, is that as a podcast host, you have to do your own work around your own judgments. And I have a clear point of view, but my point of view is actually, the answer is it depends, right? So it's like,
Yeah.
so I don't have a lot of judgments around things in the health community. Like I'm all for natural ways, but I'm not against if you want to use drugs, like medication, So I think as a podcast host, we have to think about, and as just less as yourself as a podcast host and more as a human being. And where might your blind spots be? Where might you not be putting yourself in someone else's shoes? And so I think doing your own personal growth work really just leads to being empathetic and people knowing that you're coming from a good place, right? And I think that's key. And then the second thing is, I think you have to trust your audience. A lot of my work is about, like, in Truce with Food, people go through a really intense change process, but I don't tell anybody what to do. And so part of it is about repairing self-trust. And so I want people I think it's always giving people a choice and then trusting that they can make that choice for themselves, because you're not their parent.
Hmm.
People need to be an adult and know when something is for them and not for them, and hopefully without judging it. I think that's getting hard today when people are feeling a lot of feelings, and understandable feelings. But I do think putting those kind of options and those statements so that people can understand what they're getting into. And, if you are a podcast host that is working with body image issues, or you're a sober coach with alcohol, or you're someone who works with trauma, right? Like, hopefully you're aware of the deeper issues, reasons people turn to food or alcohol or their coping mechanisms. And so you can bring that level of sensitivity to know when there is a choice to be had or a choice to be made.
I think that's really helpful to know. I personally wanted to ask that because even though I've hosted a variety of podcasts and I put out hundreds of episodes in my career working with different companies, I've never had like very deep topics, like not to the extent that you've been speaking about on your show. But I do acknowledge the fact that there's the potential that these conversations that I have will exist on the internet forever. So even though I can fully stand behind everything that I've said, and I don't like I'm not super controversial or voice any kind of opinions that are likely to upset or trigger anyone. It's just more being aware that yeah, like once something's up on the internet, it's you can't get it back.
I just, so you know, I think about that because, like, I talked about how our podcast like changed once Trump was elected and Juliet decided not to be a host. And I had a huge problem with him being elected. I mean, it made me question everything. I went on a deep dive into anti-racist work, all that kind of stuff. And I still stand by that. I wish he was not elected. And there's things that I feel differently about now, not necessarily about him, but I hope that people understand, if they're in touch with their own humanity, that people change. And, I mean, so it's like, I totally know what you mean. And I think if we can give ourselves that compassion as well, like,
Yeah.
that's the problem sometimes. I think if we think we have to be a brand, right? Branding is inherently at odds with humanity, because a brand has to be consistent, stable. People have to feel like they're getting some sort of emotional projection onto it. But as human beings, I hope we grow and change.
Yeah. I think that's solid advice, especially for like podcast hosts, because there's one of the things that I see when I look at a research podcast, there can be such a variance of opinions, of beliefs, of thoughts, especially in this space. So I think that advice is super helpful. And really, I've only got a couple of questions left that I wanted to ask, but one of them, it's a bit of a hard turn, but where do you host your podcast, Insatiable, and why did you pick this platform?
Yeah. So I used to be with Libsyn, and that felt like it worked really well. And then, as I told you before, my husband has come on and is starting to help me with this. And he moved us over to Buzzsprout. Have you heard of Buzzsprout?
Yep.
And part of why we did that was it gets to a lot more platforms, even like the obscure ones. But again, if you're only thinking of like volume, you're not thinking of like dedication, loyalty, engaged users. And some of these smaller platforms have really like champion podcast listeners, right? So that's part of it. The other reason that we did it was they have this option for dynamic content. So, for example, when we started up this last season, which was Thrown for the Midlife Loop, right before we started that up, we were able to put a new intro on all past episodes that said, hey, thanks for finding a past episode. Wanted to let you know a new season is coming up. My Truce with Food program is starting to launch. So that's amazing to do, right? You can like change your advertising and the message that you want people to have at all times. So those were some of the big reasons I remember Carlos told us to switch. But again, I don't want to be in the details. I trust him.
Do you know if Libsyn had the option of dynamic ads?
I don't know if it does.
Interesting.
I don't think it does. Do you?
I don't know. We use Podbean, and the reason why I went for that is one, because I've known them for many years. I've actually sat in on like a lot. They do a lot of webinars, and I really enjoyed their approach to podcasting. Even though Libsyn is like one of the key players, and I know a lot of people use that. But I also knew that Podbean allows for like dynamic ad placement, which is exactly what you're talking about. And that was like a major point for me. So I was like, you know what? They've got exactly what we need, so we're going to go with them. But I don't know. I was just curious to know if they did. But no worries if you don't know.
Yeah, I'm not sure. I'm not sure.
No, your department. I get that's Carlos.
Yeah.
To speak with him.
Yeah, you can bring him on.
Yeah.
We both love to research and do rabbit holes.
Yeah. Awesome. Well, the only question that I wanted to ask really before we conclude today is, do you have any other advice for podcasters looking to grow their audience and bring in revenue or monetize their show?
Yeah, I mean, I think it comes back to, first of all, thinking about what purpose within your business model does your podcast serve? And I think one thing we didn't talk about is how it helps you develop relationships with people you want to have relationships with. I've had a lot of people on that it's been the start of a really great relationship, hopefully potential collaborations, et cetera. So I think that's also something to think about for the business purpose. But I think understanding what you want your podcast to do, because there's a lot of things it can do besides just get tons of downloads, right? So I think that's important. And then the other thing is just to get started and do it. Don't build it up. Again, I mean, I think of how far my show has come, and you just get better by doing it is what I think. But the other thing I would say is try not to say the same thing everyone else is saying at the same time. I'm in the health and wellness space, and sometimes it just all starts to sound the same. You might get more growth that way. I don't know how those shows are doing, but I do think it's important to find like, what is your, like, we all have special talents and gifts that we bring to the world, and make sure that those get displayed in your conversations.
Yeah, I think most people underestimate the reality of like how important having a niche is, or how important it is to have your own little space rather than imitating what everyone else is doing. And now, Ali, that's everything that I wanted to cover today, and I've really enjoyed this. So I would highly recommend everyone goes and checks out Insatiable. Please leave it a review wherever you get your podcasts. And Ali, if people want to keep up with the work that you are doing, what's the best way for them to do that?
Yeah. Well, check out my Insatiable podcast. Did I plug that? I don't know. I don't know if I even mentioned it. The name of it. Obviously, I mentioned my podcast. But yeah, Insatiable. And then you can find me at alishapiro.com. And I do post some clips for my podcast interviews on Instagram at Ali, ALIM Shapiro, SHAPIRO.
Fantastic. Excellent. Thank you, Ali. We'll have those in the show notes. But otherwise, as always, it is an absolute pleasure chatting with you.
You too, Sam.
Thanks for joining us today. And remember, you can find more helpful resources to grow your business with podcasting on our blog at PodWritten.com and on Instagram at PodWritten. You can also find a full transcript for this episode on our website, so be sure to visit PodWritten.com or follow the links in the episode description. Until next time, stay healthy, happy, and successful.